name is Peter Utting. I work at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, which is a research center in the United Nations system, where I wear two hats. I'm deputy director, and I also coordinate a number of research projects on topics like social dimensions of green economy, corporate social responsibility, and more recently on social and solidarity economy. The talk was on social equity, structural change, and crisis, where we wanted to look at what are the factors that have promoted social equality historically, and what sort of policies should we be looking at today to enhance social equity. What I did was present some fairly recent UNRISD work where we looked at countries that have been relatively successful historically or in recent decades in reducing poverty and in enhancing equality, and looked at what are the lessons that can be learned from the experience of those countries. And I contrasted that experience and those lessons with what is often being proposed in mainstream policy circles today. What we do at UNRISD is we work very much at the interface of international policy making with academia and with civil society networks. So a crucial stakeholder for us is the academic community. So we engage a lot with researchers in universities all around the world. Within Switzerland, we like to take all opportunities to go and present our work and discuss and debate our work with students and academic institutions, and this is a very important aspect of our work. What I'll also be doing, which is somewhat different, is referring much more to the context of developing countries, which is really the focus of work at UNRISD, the UN Research Institute for Social Development, where I work. Just two words about UNRISD. We're sort of an unusual entity in the UN system where we have an autonomous status, which gives us tremendous freedom to do and say what we want. But we don't receive a single cent from the regular UN budget, so we depend on voluntary external contributions. And we work very much with networks of researchers in developing countries on a broad range of socio-political, socio-economic issues. What I want to do in this talk is refer to, in particular, to two publications which UNRISD worked on recently. One is the flagship report called Combating Poverty and Inequality. This was a very large study on looking at the sort of historical determinants, drivers of poverty reduction and policies to enhance equality, particularly in developing countries. I'll also refer to a book we published just after the 2008 crisis called The Global Crisis and Transformative Social Change. And I'll briefly refer to some work I did more recently in a book that was launched last month, I believe, at the Delhi Conference on Sustainable Development called Reducing Inequalities, where I have a chapter called Pathways to Sustainability in a Crisis-Ridden World. In the report, the flagship report, Combating Poverty and Inequality, the sorts of key questions we were asking is, why have some countries been more successful at reducing poverty and enhancing equality in relatively short periods of time? What is it that they were doing? How do current approaches to poverty reduction compare and contrast with the lessons of the past in terms of what was done? And the sort of cases we were looking at in that report were particularly the Nordic countries, East Asia, Costa Rica, Mauritius, the state of Kerala in India, Botswana, and Brazil. And so what I'll be doing here is, in this talk, I want to look at what are the key drivers and factors that emerged from our analysis of poverty reduction in the past, contrast that with what we might call today's orthodoxy, and then finally I'll say something about possible pathways out of the current crises, which isn't just financial and economic, but it's also related to food and climate change. So the central message in the report is very simple, sounds very perhaps obvious, but it says, in relation to the economic field, as we've heard from the previous speakers, the key importance of employment-centered structural change. In relation to social and social policy, the importance of a comprehensive set of social policies, including universal social protection, social services, and investment in social infrastructure. And related to the political, the importance of state capacity, contestation, effective participation, broad-based sort of social pacts and compromises, and what more generally we might call active citizenship. And what sort of comes out very clearly from the analysis we did is that significant reductions in poverty generally result not from policies aimed specifically at reducing poverty or aimed at the poor, but from a mix of policies that have wider economic, social, and political objectives. And that if poverty is to be reduced and equity is to be enhanced, then we need economic and social policies and institutions and political arrangements that are mutually supportive and synergistic. So that gets us away from sort of the focus on very specific policy instruments or a reliance, excessive reliance on specific policy instruments. And we need to look at that, the way in which the economic, social, political mesh and interact in ways that are more complementary and synergistic. So related to the first aspect, employment-centered structural change, as we've heard, employment is sort of the key channel for sharing income derived from growth. Policies in the countries we looked at, there was a considerable focus on fairly proactive policies related to support agriculture, industrial policy in favoring certain types of industries. And not only that, but also policies that ensured a complementarity between domestic agriculture and industry. The policies to stimulate domestic demand and production, significant investment in infrastructure and human capital, and sort of counter-cyclical policies, or at least avoiding restrictive monetary and fiscal policies during periods of slow growth. Now, very in general terms, and in the interest of a debate, I'm not going to be too nuanced here. So let me characterize what one might say is today's economic orthodoxy. As I say, a lot of this focuses not just on the OECD, but particularly in developing countries, where we see a considerable focus on policies to promote export orientation, the opening up of economies to food imports, often cheap food imports, which can destabilize domestic agriculture. As we've heard a lot of, the flexibilization of labor markets, which have all sorts of implications for decent work or indecent work, and the current focus on sort of austerity and the much longer focus we've had on pro-cyclical policies. We have the phenomenon whereby productivity growth is now sort of decoupled from employment and real wages. The ILO's recent wage report shows that until relatively recently there was a sort of a productivity growth increased, and there wasn't a significant divergence in terms of real wages and employment, but now that the gap is widening. And as I said, the sort of neglect of domestic agriculture and industrial policy. The new sort of structural realities related to financialization and informalization, which can have all sorts of problematic effects from the perspective of social equity. The declining investment in non-financial sectors, the sort of focus on, because of pressures we've heard about from financial markets, on short-term profits rather than long-term performance of companies. Financial markets that are exerting more pressure for more labor market flexibility, public sector cuts, etc. And the sort of the income shift from both from wages to profits, but also from companies investing productively, that sort of productive investment to a greater share for dividends and returns to shareholders. Similarly, with the trends associated with the informalization or tertiarization of economies, we see the sort of the incapacity now of the classic conventional model of industrialization to absorb surplus labor from agriculture. The rise of precarious employment and casualization, less job security, lower incomes for large sectors of the population, and also limited access to social services and social insurance. In the second area I mentioned of social policy, if we look at what countries did historically, social policy wasn't just about narrow forms of social protection. Social policy had multiple tasks. It had to deal with issues of social protection. It had to deal with issues of redistribution through things like human capital formation. It linked directly to the economic sphere and production, and it had to deal with issues to do with social reproduction and care and the situation of women and households. Now, governments of the countries we looked at addressed to some extent these different dimensions, but with very different priorities. But at least there was usually some notion that all these multiple tasks were important. And social policy wasn't just seen as an add-on, something that's secondary to economic policy, but it was seen as key for economic and social structural change. Contrast that with today's social policy orthodoxy, and we see much more emphasis on targeted social protection, targeting the poor. We see quite a considerable emphasis on active labor market policies to do with human capital formation. We see the privatization of social services. This is very different from what we see in the past. So aspects to do with universal coverage, with redistribution and social reproduction and care tend to be neglected. And this gives rise to all sorts of social equity concerns, the debate about targeting versus universalization in social policy, the focus on equality of opportunities rather than equality of outcomes. Or if you read this month's edition of Foreign Affairs, the article by Jerry Muller on capitalism and inequality, he's saying there that let's not even worry about equality of opportunities. Basically, it's a drain on resources that could be used more efficiently. Let's just have innovation, safety nets for the ones who really fall through the cracks, and let's get back to reasserting the role of the family and family values. So, but usually it's our debate, which we have at UNRISD with institutions like the World Bank, is that they're focusing too much on aspects to do with equality of opportunities and not equality of outcomes. Then the big issue of the double burden for women, that increasingly they're being called on to be breadwinners. At the same time, they and families are supposed to assume responsibility as primary caregivers. And the issues to do with privatization, the work we've done, for example, on water privatization, showing that in some respects it may facilitate access to services, but the huge issue of affordability of services becomes a real problem for many income groups. The third condition related to the politics is that of the need for active states, citizens, and social pacts or compromises. Politics matters. The importance of effective state capacity, which includes sort of competent and decently paid bureaucracies. Clearly, democratization has been important in facilitating electoral competition between parties, and that the tendency is, as we've seen recently in Brazil, is I think a classic example where through electoral competition, certain policy approaches that have been fairly conducive to policy tend to get institutionalized. It's not easy just for one party to be ousted and another to come in, and then to, over time, for them to sort of start something completely new, that some of these policies do get institutionalized. The issues of corporate accountability, how should big corporations be held to account? Questions of advocacy, contestation, and social movements. And effective participation. At UNRISD, we have a strong critique of contemporary notions of participation, which basically boil down to dialogue with certain stakeholders. We coined a definition of participation back in 1979, which said that participation is about the organized efforts of the disadvantaged to gain control over resources and regulatory institutions that affect their lives. And so this is a very different notion of participation. This is about collective organization, it's about mobilization, contestation, advocacy, and not just sort of sanitized stakeholder dialogues. And we see historically the issue of broad-based sort of social pacts and compromise, which I'll mention later. Contrast that with today's political sort of orthodoxy and practice. We see the rolling back of state capacity, sort of what we might call low-intensity democracy, where citizens are asked to just turn up every 4 or 5 years to vote. As I said, participation sort of linked more to stakeholder consultation. Corporate accountability, we have this fairly dynamic corporate social responsibility movement, but very much centered on companies regulating themselves and voluntary initiatives rather than sort of harder forms of regulation. And sort of often we see a sort of a perspective on conflictual contestation, people on the street saying, demanding things, as sort of passé and ideological. We don't need that anymore. We can sit around the table and discuss these things. And we see movements are often fragmented, both from each other and often from political parties. And little notion of this idea of a sort of grand compromise, which happened sometimes in the past. Just turning to the current crises, and the sort of implications of what's happening today for sort of social equity. And here, as I said, I'm thinking more of the multiple crises related to finance, food, and climate, which is the piece I wrote about in the book, Reducing Inequalities. I think a useful starting point when thinking about the implications of crisis is, okay, what's the nature of the crisis we're facing? As Bob Jessup says, is it a crisis in the system or is it a crisis of the system? If it's a crisis in the system, it requires reforming, institutional reforms, it requires some sort of crisis management. If it's a crisis of the system, this requires much deeper transformations in economic and social structures and in power relations. And I think what's happening now is a discursive struggle is taking place involving proponents of at least, and there will be more, but at least 3 different pathways to growth, equity, and sustainability. And I and others have sort of categorized these in terms of three, or we've labeled these in three ways. First, perhaps we could call it the market liberal approach. Again, we heard about many of its features earlier. In relation to the financial crisis, is sort of the idea of, okay, let's go for growth, but with some sort of bit more responsibility. Let's cut public deficits, key role for monetary policy, key role for innovation, active labor market policies, corporate social responsibility, voluntary codes, and safety nets. In relation to the food crisis, the idea of a new green revolution, where you have agricultural intensification, you have the integration of small producers in global value chains. And in relation to climate change, the notion of sort of market-led or corporate-led green economy, where you have focus very much on technological solutions and eco-efficiency, market-based incentives and better pricing, and things like reduction in fuel subsidies. The second pathway we can call, along the lines that John Ruggie, the label he used to refer to sort of the post-war scenario, that of embedded liberalism. Embedded liberalism says, okay, let's accept we have a capitalist system, we're going to have big corporations. Markets will produce perverse effects, and we need certain institutions in place to mitigate those effects. So the focus here for the financial crisis, sort of let's have a bit more regulated growth and a new social contract. Financial regulation, Keynesian stimulus early on, as we heard in the crisis cycle, more comprehensive social policy, and new mechanisms for financing development, such as Tobin tax, etc. For the food crisis, then let's more attention to aspects to do with food security, through what's World Bank and others call sustainable intensification. FAO and IFAD will talk about multifunctional agriculture, not just the focus on export orientation. Public investment in rural infrastructure, economic empowerment of small farmers and small producers, and ethical trade standards. And in relation to climate change, what UNEP and others call the Green New Deal, where you have green economy plus economic restructuring associated with green jobs and compensation for people who are going to lose out from that transition process. Tim Jackson and others talk about relative and absolute decoupling of environment and growth. And so the market liberal approach will focus very much on just the relative decoupling, that emissions and material throughput should decline relative to rates of economic growth. Embedded liberalism starts to acknowledge also the idea that we may need some sort of absolute decoupling, and also calling for both voluntary and mandatory environmental regulation, not just the primary focus on the voluntary. And the third pathway we might call the Alter-Globalization pathway. This is what you hear a lot about in the World Social Forum and other places. Is a very different perspective in relation to the financial crisis. It's saying we need a much more people-centered economy. We need financial corporate regulation and downsizing of financial sector and corporations. We need a much stronger redistributive policy at both national and international levels, and employment generation via public goods and sort of social economy initiatives. In the food crisis, the emphasis is very much on food sovereignty. We need redistribution associated with agrarian reform, local knowledge, local production, local trade, and not just the economic empowerment of small producers, but also their political empowerment, so they can be a force to bargain and negotiate and constitute an effective interest group. And controls on agribusiness, supermarkets, and so-called land grabs. And in relation to climate change, I think the Quechuan notion of buen vivir, which calls for respecting the rights of Mother Earth and living in harmony with diverse cultures, is probably a good descriptor of the climate change approach. And the focus very much there on not just the relative, but the absolute decoupling. The politics of the pathways I think, is crucial. What we saw perhaps in the Mexico crises of 82 and 94 was very much they followed the market liberal pathway. We see the rise of technocracy, of organized business interests, decline of sort of organized labor, the rise of neoliberalism and the NAFTA free trade agreement. The pathway out of the Great Depression in the 30s and of course post-war Europe was very much the embedded liberal pathway. That's what got us the welfare state. We had a strong labor movement, we had the social democracy, and business interests, or certain business interests, had been weakened through those processes before. So there was a shift in the relative power balance there. Similarly, in the Asian crisis of the late 90s, I think very much more of an embedded liberal pathway, developmental states coupled in the context of democratization and active citizenship, broaden sort of things like social policy. With Alter-Globalization, we've rarely seen it as a pathway out of crisis, but what we are seeing is it's sort of being played out in local community responses and in what we can call the social and solidarity economy initiatives. In terms of national policy, I suppose the thing that gets closest to it is the experience of ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas, involving Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Nicaragua, Cuba, etc. So Europe 2013, what's happening? And I think it's still, this isn't my area of expertise, but I sense that things are very uncertain. We're not sure yet what the political pathway, what the political context is going to be and what sort of pathway will emerge. I think activism, active citizenship, in some respects appears weak and very much on the defensive. We see the rise of new parties, left and right, and unusual hybrids. Electoral competition through people voting every 4 or 5 years is obviously key. They get rid of the parties in power, as we've seen in several countries. I think the crucial thing, which is different to some of the contexts of the past, is the strength of organized business interests and finance capital. It's incredibly strong. As we heard, it's the financial markets and other markets that are influencing, as Miguel said, what governments are doing. And I just end on this note of Robert Reich in his book Supercapitalism talks about this issue of personal identity politics, and referring to the advanced capitalist countries. He said what's happened over 30 years is that within each of us in the advanced capitalist countries, we have four identities: that of the worker, that of the citizen, that of the consumer, and that of the investor. And he's saying over 30 years, the consumer and the investor in us, and the perceptions and perspectives and interests that go along with that, have come to the fore within all of us. And perhaps the crisis will reassert our identities as workers and citizens. And it's maybe that sort of a shift that needs to take place if we're going to not just stay in the sort of the clutches of the market liberal approach. And just to end with a sort of a plea for intellectual pluralism. If one analyzes all these different pathways and perspectives, they all have their strengths and they all have their weaknesses. At the moment, the dominant policy approach, I think, leans heavily towards the market liberal pathway. Embedded liberalism may be showing some signs of a sort of comeback. We see it in the context of the BRICS. We see it discursively in the context of the debates going on about a post-2015 development agenda. And I think there's far less attention, and more attention should be given to alter-globalization perspectives within mainstream knowledge and policy circles. And on that front, the next big UNRISD conference links to that very much, the alter-globalization perspective. And we're organizing a conference from 6 to 8 May on the potential limits of social and solidarity economy, which will be held at the ILO. And so if you're interested in that particular approach and perspective, I invite you all to register and come. Thank you very much.